At dawn near the Pacific, a former child star lies silent in a borrowed house. Her name once spoken with laughter by millions. Pills, unanswered questions, and a vanished doctor hover in the air as Hollywood's promise dissolves into an ending no script ever explained to a waiting, bewildered world. Welcome to Midnight Biographies. Tell us where you are listening from tonight and what hour holds you company. If these stories speak to you, subscribe and let us begin together. Anissa Jones entered the world quietly, without the trappings of fame or the distant hum of studio lights. She was born on March 11, 1958, in Lafayette, Indiana, a modest Midwestern town shaped by factories, front porches, and the steady rhythms of post-war American life. The country was entering an age of optimism, when television sets were becoming fixtures in living rooms and families gathered in the evenings around glowing screens. Yet in those early months of Anissa's life, there was nothing to suggest she would become part of that new national ritual. Her beginnings were ordinary, grounded in domestic routines and private hopes that belonged only to her parents. Her mother, Mary Jones, was young and determined, a woman shaped by the expectations placed on women in the 1950s, yet quietly restless beneath them. Her father, John Jones, was more reserved, practical, and cautious. Together they tried to build a stable household, but cracks appeared early. Not long after Anissa's younger brother Paul was born, tensions that had simmered beneath the surface hardened into open conflict. The marriage deteriorated, and what followed was not a clean separation, but a prolonged and bitter struggle over custody, finances, and control. Even before Anissa could form memories, her life was already being shaped by adult battles she could not understand. The Jones household became divided not just by distance, but by competing visions of the future. Mary believed deeply that her daughter possessed something special. It was not yet called talent, but she sensed an attentiveness in Anissa, an ability to mimic, to listen closely, to respond with unusual emotional clarity. In later years, some would call this sensitivity a gift. Others would wonder if it was simply a child adapting instinctively to unstable surroundings. Either way, Mary's gaze increasingly fixed on her daughter, seeing in her both promise and possibility. Indiana, however, felt too small for those possibilities. As the custody battle dragged on, Mary made a decision that would alter the course of her children's lives. She moved west to California, taking Anissa and Paul with her. The journey itself carried symbolic weight. In the American imagination, California was not merely a place, but an idea, a landscape where reinvention was possible, and where dreams, however fragile, might take solid form. For Mary, it represented escape from stagnation and proximity to opportunity. For Anissa, still barely old enough to speak in full sentences, it was simply a long drive away from everything familiar. California in the early 1960s was alive with motion. Freeways stretched endlessly, suburbs expanded, and the entertainment industry pulsed quietly behind studio gates. Television production was booming, fueled by networks hungry for wholesome programming that reflected idealized American families. In this environment, children were not only participants but essential symbols, embodying innocence, continuity, and comfort for viewers navigating a rapidly changing world. Mary noticed this immediately. Encouraged by neighbors who found Anissa charming and expressive, she began taking her daughter to auditions, initially for commercials. The process was informal at first, almost playful, but success came quickly, and with it, structure. At the age of 4, Anissa was enrolled in dance classes. The studios smelled faintly of resin and polished floors, and mirrors reflected small bodies learning discipline before they learned desire. Anissa adapted easily. She followed instructions, repeated movements, and smiled when asked. Commercial work followed soon after. By the age of 6, she appeared in advertisements for cereal and household products, her face becoming familiar in brief flashes between programs. Each appearance reinforced Mary's belief that they were on the right path. Yet beneath the surface, the unresolved custody battle continued to exert pressure, pulling Anissa back and forth between legal definitions of belonging. Eventually, the courts ruled in favor of Anissa's father, granting him custody. But by that time, momentum had already taken hold. Anissa remained largely with her mother, moving between homes, schedules, and expectations. Stability became fragmented. The adults around her argued over her future, while simultaneously relying on her growing success to justify their choices. In this environment, Anissa learned early to observe rather than question, to comply rather than resist. She became, as many later recalled, remarkably polite, eager to please, and deeply attentive to emotional cues. These qualities would soon define her public image, but at this early stage, they were survival tools. The child who would later charm millions was first a child learning how to navigate uncertainty. Her world was shaped by auditions, rehearsals, and adult conversations conducted just out of earshot. Childhood for her did not unfold as a gradual exploration, but as a sequence of appointments, expectations, and quiet adjustments. By the mid-1960s, the television industry was actively seeking child performers who could project sincerity without precociousness. Producers wanted children who appeared natural, unaffected, and endlessly likable. Anissa fit this unspoken requirement perfectly. She was small for her age, with a soft voice and an expressive face that conveyed vulnerability without distress. These qualities were not taught. They emerged organically from her temperament. Yet once recognized, they were carefully preserved and reinforced by those around her. As Anissa approached her 8th birthday, the distance between her private life and her public potential narrowed. She had already spent years learning how to stand under bright lights without squinting, how to repeat lines without boredom, how to accept praise without surprise. What she had not yet learned was how temporary all of it could be. At that moment, the road ahead still seemed wide and open, framed by palm trees and possibility. The casting room that would change her life forever waited quietly in Los Angeles, its chairs arranged neatly, scripts stacked on a table. Outside, traffic moved steadily, unaware that another American child was about to be woven into the fabric of national memory. Anissa walked toward that room holding her mother's hand, unaware that the simplicity of that gesture would soon vanish, replaced by something far more complicated. As the door opened and she stepped inside, the air seemed to still, as if pausing to take note. Somewhere far beyond that room, millions of living rooms waited, though none yet knew her name. The moment hovered, unspoken and unresolved, like a breath held just before the future begins to speak. The air in that casting room had seemed to pause, as if even the walls were waiting. Anissa stood small against the furniture, meant for adults, her feet not quite touching the floor as she sat, her hands folded carefully in her lap. She did not yet know the language of auditions, the subtle dance between confidence and compliance, but she understood something more basic. She understood that adults were watching, and that watching meant opportunity. When she spoke, her voice was soft and steady. When she smiled, it came naturally, without strain. It was the kind of smile that suggested trust, and in an industry hungry for reassurance, trust was a rare and valuable thing. The producers saw it immediately. They did not speak of talent in elaborate terms. They spoke instead of presence, of ease, of how the camera seemed to settle when it rested on her face. She was not flashy or theatrical. She did not push herself forward. She waited, responded, listened. For a medium like television, which sought to enter the quiet spaces of American homes, this quality mattered deeply. Within weeks, the decision was made. Anissa Jones was cast as Buffy, the youngest child in a new CBS sitcom titled Family Affair. For Anissa, the change was swift and nearly total. The audition room gave way to sound stages, and the quiet instructions of casting assistants were replaced by the structured rhythm of television production. She was 8 years old, but physically smaller than most children her age, which allowed her to portray a character several years younger. This detail, practical at first, would later carry consequences no one yet considered. At the time, it simply meant continuity. Buffy would remain little, even as Anissa grew. Family Affair presented itself as a comforting story for American audiences. 3 orphaned children sent to live with their wealthy uncle in New York, guided by gentle humor and domestic warmth. It was an idealized vision of family life, one that avoided conflict and promised resolution within half an hour. Buffy, with her pigtails and earnest expressions, became the emotional center of that promise. She was innocence personified, a reminder of simplicity in a world increasingly marked by political unrest and cultural change. The schedule was demanding from the start. Television, unlike film, required consistency above all else. Episodes were produced year-round, leaving little room for rest. Anissa attended school on set, taught by studio teachers between scenes. Her days were carefully partitioned, moving from classroom to makeup chair to rehearsal with minimal transition. Lunch breaks were timed, wardrobe fittings precise. Childhood, in this environment, became something to be managed rather than experienced. Her mother remained close, overseeing every detail. Mary Jones was vigilant, protective, and deeply invested in her daughter's success. She monitored Anissa's performances closely, offering guidance and correction. To some, this devotion appeared admirable. To others, it seemed heavy. But Mary believed she was safeguarding her child, ensuring she did not lose her place in an industry that could be unforgiving. The custody battle with Anissa's father continued in the background, an unresolved tension that mirrored the instability beneath the show's polished surface. Despite the intensity of the work, Anissa adapted with remarkable composure. Cast and crew frequently commented on her professionalism, noting how she remembered lines, hit marks, and waited patiently for direction. She was described as polite, gentle, and eager to help. She formed bonds easily, particularly with her brother Paul, who often accompanied her to the set. Whenever Anissa received gifts from fans or studio executives, she insisted that Paul receive something as well. If there was only one item, she would give it away. This instinct to share, to soften the imbalance around her, became one of her defining traits. As the show gained popularity, Anissa's face became ubiquitous. Letters arrived daily from viewers who felt they knew her personally. Merchandise followed quickly. The character of Buffy was rarely seen without her doll, Mrs. Beasley, a prop that soon transcended the screen. A real version was produced and released to the public, becoming one of the best-selling dolls in the country. Children carried Mrs. Beasley into their own homes, reenacting scenes they had watched only hours before. Anissa's image appeared on lunchboxes, coloring books, clothing, and even a cookbook. Her likeness became a commodity, replicated endlessly while the real child remained largely unseen. Public appearances became part of her routine. She appeared on talk shows, seated beside adult hosts who marveled at her poise. She presented an award at the Emmy ceremonies, one of the youngest to do so, standing beneath stage lights that dwarfed her small frame. Each appearance reinforced her identity as America's little girl, a symbol that belonged not to herself, but to a collective imagination. Yet within the structure of success, subtle strains began to emerge. The long hours left little time for unscripted play. Friendships outside the industry were difficult to maintain. Schooling was fragmented, shaped by filming schedules rather than developmental needs. Anissa learned early to read adult moods, adjusting her behavior to maintain harmony. Praise came readily, but it was conditional, tied always to performance. The set itself, while friendly, operated under constant pressure. Deadlines loomed, scripts changed, network expectations intensified as ratings climbed. Anissa worked 7-day weeks at times, her small body absorbing a pace designed for adults. She rarely complained. Those around her took her compliance as resilience, not recognizing the quiet cost of adaptation. Family Affair climbed steadily in the ratings, eventually reaching the top position. For CBS, it was a triumph. For Anissa, it was a closed circle, one that defined her entirely. The character of Buffy did not age. Her innocence was fixed, preserved for syndication and reruns. As Anissa matured privately, the gap between who she was and who she was expected to be widened. Still at this stage, the future appeared secure. Success suggested continuity. Few questioned whether a child could outgrow a role that had so thoroughly defined her. Fewer still asked what might happen when the audience moved on. For now, the cameras kept rolling. The laugh track played on cue, and Anissa continued to smile, fulfilling the expectations placed upon her with quiet grace. Late one evening, after the studio lights dimmed and the set emptied, Mrs. Beasley remained propped in a chair, her painted eyes staring forward. Anissa walked past her on the way out, pausing briefly before leaving the soundstage behind. Outside, the parking lot was dark and still, and the echoes of scripted laughter faded into the night, unanswered. The laughter that had echoed across the empty soundstage lingered in memory even as the days pressed forward. Each morning, the lights returned, bright and unquestioning, and with them came the familiar rhythms that had already come to define Anissa Jones's life. By now, Buffy was no longer simply a character. She was a fixture, a presence expected to arrive on time, deliver innocence reliably, and leave no trace of fatigue behind. The distinction between Anissa and Buffy began to soften, not because the child forgot herself, but because the world around her rarely asked her to be anything else. Family Affair settled into its place within American households with remarkable ease. It aired during a period when viewers sought reassurance, when families, fractured by generational change and social unrest, turned to television for stability. Buffy's wide-eyed sincerity offered that stability. She asked simple questions, expressed uncomplicated emotions, and resolved her troubles neatly within the frame of each episode. For audiences, she represented a version of childhood untouched by uncertainty. For Anissa, she represented continuity, a role that demanded she remain small, sweet, and unchanged even as the calendar moved forward. The production pace intensified as the show's success grew. Scripts arrived weekly, often with revisions made moments before filming. Anissa learned to adapt quickly, absorbing changes without complaint. She stood patiently while adults adjusted lights and microphones around her. She waited while scenes were rehearsed repeatedly, sometimes long after her energy waned. The set became both workplace and classroom, a closed ecosystem where time was measured in takes rather than seasons. Her schooling continued under the guidance of studio tutors, but it followed an irregular cadence. Lessons were interrupted by call times and retakes. Knowledge came in fragments, shaped by necessity rather than curiosity. While other children learned in groups, forming friendships and rivalries, Anissa's education unfolded in relative isolation. She became accustomed to adult conversation, to being the youngest person in the room, expected to listen more than speak when the cameras were off. Despite these constraints, Anissa remained notably generous. Crew members often recalled how she greeted everyone by name, how she noticed when someone seemed tired or distracted. If a guest actor appeared nervous, she would approach them, offering a smile or a quiet word. These gestures were not rehearsed. They emerged naturally, perhaps shaped by her awareness of emotional undercurrents, perhaps by a desire to keep peace in an environment that depended on harmony. The merchandise surrounding Family Affair continued to expand. Mrs. Beasley, once a simple prop, took on a life of her own. Children carried the doll through department stores and down sidewalks, clutching it tightly as if it offered comfort beyond play. For Anissa, seeing her on-screen companion transformed into an object of mass affection was both affirming and disorienting. The doll did not age. It did not tire. It did not feel the weight of repetition. It existed solely to be loved. Public recognition followed Anissa wherever she went. Strangers stopped her in restaurants and airports, commenting on how she seemed exactly as they imagined. They expected her to perform, to smile, to respond with the same sweetness they saw on screen. Rarely did anyone ask how she felt or what she wanted beyond the role she embodied so convincingly. Her identity, as perceived by the public, became fixed early, leaving little room for deviation. As seasons passed, subtle changes appeared. Anissa grew taller, her voice shifted slightly, her expressions deepened. These changes were natural, inevitable, but they posed challenges for a show built on constancy. Writers adjusted scripts to preserve Buffy's childlike innocence, often emphasizing her naivety even as Anissa's understanding expanded. The gap between her internal awareness and her external portrayal widened quietly, without acknowledgement. Behind the scenes, discussions about the show's direction grew more frequent. Network executives monitored ratings closely, pushing for storylines that maintained appeal. The cast felt the pressure, though it manifested differently for each member. For Anissa, the pressure was largely unspoken. She sensed it in the tightened schedules, the increased scrutiny of her performance, the subtle reminders to remain endearing. Her relationship with her mother became more complex during this time. Mary continued to manage Anissa's career diligently, advocating for her interests and maintaining control over financial and professional decisions. To Mary, vigilance was protection. To Anissa, it was the only framework she knew. Yet, as Anissa aged, moments of resistance surfaced, fleeting and easily suppressed. She expressed boredom occasionally, a desire to do something different, something older. These comments were often met with reassurance or redirection rather than exploration. The custody battle with her father lingered as an unresolved tension. Though legal decisions had been made, emotional divisions remained. Visits were inconsistent, shaped by schedules that prioritized production over personal connection. Anissa learned to compartmentalize, separating her public life from private longing. Her brother Paul remained a constant presence, a reminder of shared history beyond the studio walls. Their bond deepened, rooted in mutual understanding and quiet solidarity. As Family Affair approached its later seasons, subtle fatigue crept into Anissa's performances. The energy that had once flowed effortlessly required more effort to summon. Viewers noticed little at first, attributing changes to natural maturation. But those closest to the production sensed a shift. Anissa remained professional, but the sparkle that had defined Buffy's earliest appearances dimmed slightly, replaced by something more subdued. The show's ratings, once unwavering, began to fluctuate. Competition increased as television audiences fragmented, drawn to new formats and themes. Family Affair, anchored in a gentler era, struggled to adapt without compromising its essence. The innocence that had once felt comforting now risked seeming outdated. Writers faced a dilemma: how to evolve a character designed not to change. For Anissa, the uncertainty surrounding the show mirrored an internal unease she could not yet articulate. She had spent years fulfilling expectations with precision, yet little space had been made for her own aspirations. The idea of an end, though distant, loomed quietly. What would remain if Buffy disappeared? The question hovered unanswered, rarely voiced but deeply felt. One afternoon, during a break between scenes, Anissa sat alone on the set, watching technicians dismantle a portion of the living room backdrop. The walls, once solid and familiar, revealed their artificial nature as panels were removed and cables exposed. The illusion dissolved easily, leaving behind bare structures and empty space. Anissa observed silently, her hands resting in her lap, as if witnessing a truth she had always sensed but never fully seen. The scene would be restored by the next morning, indistinguishable from before. But the image lingered. Beneath the polished surface lay something temporary, something subject to change without warning. As the set lights dimmed once more and the crew dispersed, Anissa walked away slowly, carrying with her the quiet awareness that what appeared permanent could vanish, leaving only memory behind. The memory of those dismantled walls lingered, even as the set was rebuilt and restored to its familiar order. Each morning, the living room of Family Affair appeared unchanged, its furniture carefully arranged, its surfaces polished and ready for the camera. Yet for Anissa Jones, something had shifted. She returned to her mark, delivered her lines, and smiled on cue. But beneath the practiced ease, there was a growing awareness that the world she inhabited was more fragile than it appeared. As the series continued, the demands placed upon her intensified in subtle ways. The production schedule remained relentless, with filming stretching across weeks that offered little distinction between weekdays and weekends. Holidays were negotiated rather than observed, their meaning reduced to adjusted call times and abbreviated celebrations. Anissa's childhood unfolded within this narrow framework, where time was measured in episodes completed and ratings achieved rather than seasons passed. The studio environment offered structure but little shelter. While adults around her debated scripts and budgets, Anissa learned to navigate fatigue quietly. She learned how to preserve energy for scenes that mattered most, how to summon enthusiasm even when her body signaled exhaustion. The camera, indifferent to human limits, demanded consistency. It captured not effort, but result. Any strain that appeared on her face was gently corrected, smoothed away with direction and makeup. Outside the studio gates, the world continued to move forward. Fashion changed. Music shifted. Conversations grew louder and more urgent, reflecting the social turbulence of the late 1960s. Yet within the frame of Family Affair, time remained suspended. The show offered refuge from change, and in doing so, required its youngest star to remain unchanged as well. Anissa felt this tension instinctively, even if she lacked the language to describe it. Her physical growth, though gradual, could not be entirely concealed. Costume adjustments became more frequent. Scripts emphasized her character's youth more insistently, reinforcing traits that no longer came naturally. Anissa complied, but the performance required increasing effort. The role that had once fit her so comfortably now felt restrictive, as though it belonged to someone else. Public expectations followed her everywhere. Interviews focused on her sweetness, her obedience, her gratitude. Rarely did anyone ask what she hoped to do next, or how she imagined her future beyond the show. The questions assumed continuity, as though Buffy would simply follow her into adulthood, unchanged by time. For Anissa, this assumption created a quiet dissonance. She sensed possibilities beyond the role, but could not yet see a clear path toward them. Her mother remained a constant presence, managing schedules, overseeing appearances, and guarding Anissa's image carefully. Mary's vigilance was shaped by fear as much as ambition. She had witnessed how quickly opportunities could vanish, how fragile success could be in an industry that thrived on novelty. To her, maintaining Anissa's position required unwavering attention. Any deviation felt risky, any expression of dissatisfaction potentially dangerous. The custody arrangement with Anissa's father continued to complicate matters. Though legal decisions had been finalized, emotional wounds remained unhealed. Visits were sporadic, shaped by filming demands and logistical challenges. Anissa learned to adapt, presenting a composed exterior regardless of circumstance. She became adept at compartmentalizing her emotions, a skill that served her well professionally but left little room for exploration or release. As the show entered its later seasons, the strain became more visible to those closest to the production. Anissa's energy flagged at times, her enthusiasm appearing more measured. She remained reliable, rarely missing cues or lines, but the effortless joy that had once characterized her performance softened. Observers noted the change without alarm, attributing it to maturity. Few considered what it meant for a child to grow up under constant observation. The network, meanwhile, began to express concern about ratings. Competition from newer programs intensified, and audiences gradually shifted their attention elsewhere. Family Affair, once a dominant presence, faced the slow erosion of relevance. Writers attempted subtle adjustments, introducing new storylines and dynamics, but the core premise remained resistant to change. The show's strength had always been its simplicity, and altering that simplicity risked undermining its appeal. For Anissa, the prospect of an ending was both unsettling and quietly relieving. The routine that had defined her life for years showed signs of weakening, yet no alternative structure emerged to replace it. She sensed that something was approaching, though its shape remained indistinct. Conversations among adults grew more guarded, references to future plans more tentative. Away from the set, Anissa began to experience moments of restlessness. She expressed boredom more openly, questioning why she always played the same kind of role. These moments were brief, often redirected toward reassurance or distraction. The prevailing belief remained that success should be appreciated rather than questioned. Gratitude, not curiosity, was expected. Despite these undercurrents, the show continued to air, episode after episode, each one reinforcing the image that had made Anissa famous. Syndication discussions began quietly, ensuring that Buffy's image would persist long after production ceased. For viewers, this promised continuity. For Anissa, it meant permanence of a different kind. The role she played as a child would follow her indefinitely, preserved and replayed without regard for her growth. As filming progressed, Anissa found herself increasingly aware of the boundaries imposed upon her. Opportunities to explore different aspects of acting were limited. Guest roles and film auditions were discussed, but rarely pursued aggressively. The priority remained Family Affair, its demands overshadowing all else. Anissa's world narrowed accordingly, focused inward on a single identity. One afternoon, during a pause in filming, Anissa wandered briefly beyond the set, stepping into a storage area where unused props and discarded furniture were kept. Objects from earlier episodes lay stacked and forgotten, their significance erased by time. She ran her fingers along a faded armchair, once central to a scene now barely remembered. The space smelled of dust and neglect, a stark contrast to the polished environment she knew so well. Standing there, surrounded by remnants of stories already told, Anissa paused. The realization was quiet, but unmistakable. Everything here had once mattered deeply, and now it waited in silence, its purpose fulfilled and forgotten. The thought lingered as she returned to the set, resuming her place beneath the lights. As the day's work concluded and the crew prepared to leave, the studio lights dimmed once more. Anissa gathered her belongings and walked toward the exit, passing rows of empty chairs and silent equipment. The familiar laughter track echoed faintly in her memory, a sound disconnected from the present moment. Outside, the evening air was cool, and the sky darkened gradually, offering no clear sign of what lay ahead. The evening air carried a softness that lingered as Anissa Jones stepped away from the studio, the door closing behind her with a familiar, muted sound. The laughter she had helped create still seemed to hover in the space she left behind, but outside there was only traffic, distant voices, and the steady movement of time. As the days followed one another, her life continued much as it had before, yet a subtle shift had taken place, one that could not be undone simply by returning to her mark and reciting lines. Anissa's kindness, long noted by those around her, became more pronounced as she grew older. It was as if she sensed, even without conscious understanding, that gentleness could serve as a form of balance in an environment shaped by pressure and expectation. On the set of Family Affair, she watched adults struggle with deadlines, egos, and exhaustion. In response, she offered patience. She thanked crew members for small acts of assistance. She listened when others spoke, even when they spoke past her. These gestures earned her admiration, but they also reinforced her role as a stabilizing presence, someone who smoothed the edges of tension rather than creating space for her own uncertainty. Her relationship with her brother Paul remained a quiet refuge. Paul was not part of the industry in the same way, and his presence grounded her in something more ordinary. When he visited the set, Anissa's demeanor softened further. She shared inside jokes with him, spoke freely in ways she rarely did with adults, and seemed briefly unburdened by the expectations attached to her public image. Their bond was built on shared displacement, on having been moved across states and schedules without much say. Together, they formed a small, private world within the larger machinery of television. As Anissa approached adolescence, her awareness of herself as a separate individual began to sharpen. She noticed how people spoke about her rather than to her, how interviews focused on her sweetness rather than her thoughts. Questions were predictable, designed to reinforce a narrative rather than explore reality. Anissa answered politely, rarely challenging the assumptions embedded within them. Yet privately, she began to question what it meant to be known so well and understood so little. The merchandise bearing her image continued to circulate widely. Mrs. Beasley dolls filled toy aisles, their presence a testament to Buffy's enduring appeal. Children clutched them tightly, finding comfort in their familiarity. Anissa encountered these dolls in stores and homes, sometimes arranged carefully on shelves, sometimes worn from years of affection. Seeing them elicited a complex response. Pride mingled with detachment. The doll represented a version of her that belonged to others, a fixed image preserved in plastic and cloth. At school on the set, lessons continued, but they rarely matched the depth or continuity of traditional education. Anissa absorbed information in fragments, often interrupted by calls to return to filming. While she learned to read scripts fluently and adapt quickly, subjects like history and science remained abstract, disconnected from lived experience. Her understanding of the world was shaped less by curriculum and more by observation. By watching adults navigate systems of power and expectation. As she matured, Anissa's performances subtly evolved. The brightness that had once defined Buffy's innocence became more restrained, replaced by a gentler, quieter presence. This change was not scripted, but it was perceptible. Writers responded by emphasizing her character's youth even more insistently, crafting scenarios that reinforced Buffy's dependence and simplicity. The effect was paradoxical. As Anissa grew more aware, her character was written to remain unaware. This tension did not erupt into conflict. Instead, it settled into a quiet resignation. Anissa continued to do what was asked of her, meeting expectations with professionalism. Yet the work began to feel repetitive, lacking the discovery that had once energized her. The role that had introduced her to the world now confined her within a narrow emotional range. Her mother, Mary, remained vigilant. She monitored Anissa's appearances, her wardrobe, her schedule. To Mary, control equated to protection. She believed that maintaining a consistent image was essential to safeguarding her daughter's future. Any hint of dissatisfaction or deviation was addressed quickly, often reframed as fatigue or temporary frustration. Mary's intentions were not malicious, but they were rooted in fear of loss, a fear shaped by years of legal battles and uncertainty. The father-daughter relationship continued to exist at a distance. Though custody had been resolved legally, emotional closeness proved elusive. Visits were irregular, constrained by production demands and lingering tension between parents. Anissa adapted by lowering expectations, learning not to rely on stability that could not be guaranteed. This adaptation, while practical, further limited her opportunities to explore her own needs and desires. As the cultural landscape shifted around her, Anissa became increasingly aware of her isolation. The late 1960s brought visible change, with new music, new voices, and new forms of expression challenging established norms. Yet within the controlled environment of family affair, these changes were largely absent. The show remained anchored in a vision of family and childhood that felt increasingly removed from contemporary reality. Anissa sensed this disconnect, even if she could not fully articulate it. Conversations about the future remained vague. When asked what she wanted to do next, Anissa often deferred, repeating phrases she had heard from adults. Acting, she said, was what she did. It was what she knew. But beneath these responses lay uncertainty. The idea of stepping outside the role that defined her felt both frightening and necessary. As the show's ratings continued to decline, discussions about its longevity grew more frequent. Anissa overheard fragments of adult conversations, references to network decisions, and shifting priorities. These discussions were rarely directed at her, but their implications were clear. The world she had known for years was approaching a turning point. One day, while waiting between scenes, Anissa found herself alone in a quiet corridor adjacent to the soundstage. The walls were lined with framed photographs from earlier seasons, capturing moments of laughter and scripted warmth. She studied them carefully, recognizing herself in each image, yet feeling distanced from the child depicted there. The photographs froze moments that no longer existed, preserving expressions that could not be recreated. As she turned away, the corridor seemed longer than before, stretching toward an uncertain end. The hum of activity from the set reached her faintly, a reminder of the work that awaited. She took a breath and returned to her place, resuming her role with practiced ease. When the day concluded and the lights dimmed once more, Anissa lingered briefly, gazing at the set that had shaped her formative years. The furniture stood in place, unchanged, awaiting the next scene. Yet she sensed that something fundamental was shifting, that the story she had lived within was nearing its conclusion. The realization was quiet, unresolved, and heavy, like a question left unanswered as she walked into the night. The question lingered with her as she walked into the night, unanswered and heavy, settling somewhere just beneath the surface of her thoughts. In the weeks that followed, The rhythm of production continued, but it carried a different weight. The set remained familiar, yet the certainty that once surrounded it had thinned. Conversations grew quieter, more careful. Adults spoke in lowered voices, glancing toward doors as if the walls themselves might listen. Anissa sensed these changes not through explanation, but through atmosphere. Something was ending, even if no one said it aloud. Family Affair had reached a point of exhaustion that no amount of goodwill could disguise. The formula that once felt timeless now struggled to hold its place in a shifting television landscape. New programs offered sharper dialogue, more complex emotions, and reflections of a country no longer content with simple resolutions. Ratings slipped gradually, not dramatically enough to provoke panic, but steadily enough to raise concern. For Anissa, the change was subtle, but unmistakable. The urgency that had once driven production softened into something more tentative, as if the show itself were unsure how to proceed. Her performances reflected this uncertainty. She remained reliable, delivering her lines with care. But the spark that had once animated Buffy no longer came effortlessly. It was not rebellion or refusal, but a quiet fatigue. The character asked her to remain perpetually young, perpetually uncomplicated, even as Anissa's own inner world grew more layered. Each scene required her to compress her expanding awareness back into a narrower frame. The adults around her responded in different ways. Some doubled down on encouragement, praising her professionalism and reminding her of how fortunate she was. Others avoided the topic altogether, focusing instead on logistics and schedules. Few addressed the underlying reality, that Anissa was outgrowing the role that had defined her, and that the industry had not prepared a clear alternative. Her mother, Mary, became increasingly watchful during this period. She monitored Anissa's mood closely, interpreting moments of quiet as signs of fatigue rather than dissatisfaction. Mary had invested years of effort into maintaining stability, and the idea of disruption felt threatening. She encouraged Anissa to focus on the present, to appreciate what she had rather than worry about what might come next. To Mary, gratitude was a form of protection. Anissa complied outwardly, but internally, a restlessness began to take shape. She wondered what it would be like to play someone older, someone flawed or uncertain. She imagined roles that allowed for complexity, for emotion that did not resolve neatly. These thoughts were fleeting, often interrupted by calls to return to set or reminders of her responsibilities. Still, they marked the beginning of a shift, a quiet desire to step beyond the boundaries that had confined her. As the final season approached, the tone on set grew reflective. Cast members reminisced about earlier episodes, sharing stories of the show's beginnings. Laughter surfaced more readily during breaks, tinged with nostalgia. Anissa listened, absorbing these memories as part of her own history, even as she struggled to reconcile them with her present feelings. The show had given her structure, identity, and security. Letting go of it felt both necessary and unsettling. When the announcement finally came, it arrived without ceremony. Family Affair would not be renewed. The decision was framed as a natural conclusion, a graceful ending to a successful run. For the network, it was a business choice. For the cast, it was a turning point. For Anissa, it was the end of the only professional life she had ever known. At 12 years old, she greeted the news with visible relief. Those close to her noted her excitement, her eagerness to move on. She spoke of new possibilities, of roles she might pursue now that she was free. The prospect of change energized her, offering a glimpse of autonomy she had not previously experienced. Yet beneath this enthusiasm lay uncertainty. Freedom arrived without guidance, leaving her to navigate a world that no longer revolved around a single set and schedule. The final days of filming were marked by ritual. Scenes were completed, props cataloged, costumes returned. The set that had once felt permanent began to empty. Furniture was moved, walls dismantled, lights removed. Anissa watched this process with a mixture of curiosity and detachment. She had seen parts of the set dismantled before, but this time felt different. This time, nothing would be rebuilt. On the last day, she stood quietly as the crew gathered for farewells. Words of appreciation were exchanged, photographs taken. Anissa accepted praise graciously, her responses measured and polite. She thanked those who had supported her, her voice steady despite the moment's significance. When the gathering ended, she lingered briefly, scanning the space that had shaped so much of her childhood. Leaving the studio that day felt unfamiliar. There was no next call time, no script waiting. The absence of routine created a void that was both liberating and disorienting. Anissa stepped outside into the afternoon light, aware that the path ahead was undefined. For the first time, she was not Buffy, yet the world still saw her that way. In the weeks that followed, Anissa began to audition for new roles. She approached these opportunities with cautious optimism, eager to demonstrate her range. Yet she quickly encountered resistance. Casting directors struggled to envision her outside the context of Family Affair. Their memories of Buffy overshadowed her present self, limiting their imagination. Anissa sensed this hesitation in their questions, in the polite dismissals that followed. The realization was painful but instructive. The role that had given her fame now constrained her future. She was no longer protected by the structure of a long-running series, yet she remained defined by it. The industry that had embraced her as a child offered little guidance as she transitioned into adolescence. At home, conversations about the future grew strained. Mary encouraged patience, reminding Anissa that success required perseverance. Anissa listened, but the reassurance rang hollow. She felt suspended between identities, no longer the child audiences adored, not yet the actress she hoped to become. The certainty that had once anchored her life was gone, replaced by a quiet, persistent unease. One evening, as the sun dipped low and shadows lengthened across the room, Anissa sat alone, flipping through old photographs from the show. Each image captured a moment that felt both intimate and distant. She studied her younger self, searching for recognition. The child smiled back, unaware of what lay ahead. As the light faded, Anissa closed the album and set it aside. Outside, the world continued its steady movement, indifferent to her uncertainty. She sat in silence, listening to the sounds of evening, aware that the chapter she had known was over, and that the next had not yet begun. The album closed with a soft sound, final, yet unremarkable, and Anissa Jones sat for a long moment with her hands resting on its cover. The photographs it held belonged to a different rhythm of life, one governed by schedules and certainty, by scripts that told her where to stand and what to say. Without them, the days ahead stretched open and undefined. In the quiet that followed the show's end, she began to understand how much of her sense of self had been shaped by external structure, and how little remained when that structure disappeared. Auditions resumed, but they carried a different tone now. The rooms were smaller, the conversation shorter. Casting directors studied her carefully, searching for traces of the child they remembered. Some smiled with recognition, others with polite confusion. They asked how she felt about growing up on television, whether she missed Buffy, whether she still owned Mrs. Beasley. Rarely did they ask what she wanted to become. Anissa answered patiently, though each question reinforced the sense that her past loomed larger than her present. She sensed hesitation in the pauses that followed her readings. The silence was not unkind, but it was decisive. Directors struggled to imagine her in roles that demanded complexity or darkness. To them, she represented innocence fixed in time, preserved through reruns and nostalgia. Anissa began to understand that success as a child did not guarantee opportunity as a teenager. In some cases, it created an obstacle more difficult to overcome than obscurity. This realization coincided with changes in her personal life. Her father, who had remained a distant but stabilizing figure, fell ill. The details were not immediately clear to Anissa, shielded as she had long been from adult realities. When his death came in March of 1974, just days before her 16th birthday, it arrived with quiet finality. There were no dramatic scenes, no cinematic closure. There was only absence. The loss unsettled her deeply, removing one of the few remaining anchors in her life. Grief entered her world without structure or guidance. There was no script for how to mourn, no rehearsal for the emotions that surfaced unexpectedly. Anissa withdrew at times, retreating into herself. At other moments, she sought distraction, filling the silence with activity and noise. The stability she had known through work was gone, and the adults around her seemed uncertain how to replace it. Her relationship with her mother grew increasingly strained. Mary, still deeply invested in Anissa's future, responded to uncertainty with control. She monitored Anissa's movements more closely, questioned her choices, and expressed concern about her changing behavior. To Mary, vigilance was necessary. To Anissa, it felt suffocating. Their conversations grew tense, marked by misunderstanding rather than dialogue. As Anissa entered her teenage years, she began spending more time away from home. She sought companionship among peers who knew her not as Buffy, but simply as Anissa. These friendships offered a sense of anonymity she had long been denied. With them, she experimented with freedom, testing boundaries without the watchful eye of cameras or managers. For the first time, she experienced adolescence not as a performance, but as an exploration. This exploration was uneven and often reckless. Without the structure that had governed her childhood, Anissa struggled to find balance. She moved between moments of excitement and periods of restlessness, her moods shifting unpredictably. Authority figures who once guided her had receded, leaving her to navigate decisions on her own. The transition from constant supervision to relative autonomy was abrupt, offering little opportunity for gradual adjustment. Attempts to find ordinary work proved frustrating. Employers recognized her, expected novelty, or questioned her reliability. Anissa found it difficult to fit into environments that did not accommodate her past or understand her present. Each rejection reinforced a sense of displacement, as though she belonged neither to the world she had left behind nor to the one she was trying to enter. Her mother's concern intensified during this period. Mary often reported Anissa missing when she did not return home for days, convinced that her daughter was falling under negative influences. These actions, intended as protection, deepened the rift between them. Anissa interpreted them as distrust, further distancing herself from the only parental figure she had left. The industry, meanwhile, continued to move forward without her. Television evolved, embracing new narratives and faces. Family Affair lived on in reruns, its episodes replayed endlessly, preserving Anissa's childhood for audiences who remembered her fondly. This perpetual presence of her younger self complicated her efforts to redefine herself. Wherever she went, Buffy followed. As she approached adulthood, Anissa found herself increasingly drawn to experiences that offered intensity and escape. Parties became frequent, social circles expanded and shifted. These environments provided a sense of belonging, however temporary, and an opportunity to step outside the constraints that had long defined her. Yet they also introduced risks she was ill-equipped to manage. The absence of consistent guidance left Anissa vulnerable. She had spent her formative years learning how to perform, not how to assess danger or navigate temptation. The confidence she displayed publicly masked an internal uncertainty that few recognized. Those around her often assumed resilience where there was fragility. In moments of quiet reflection, Anissa questioned how her life might have unfolded differently. She wondered whether another role, another path, might have allowed her to grow without losing herself. These thoughts surfaced late at night, when distractions faded and the weight of expectation pressed more heavily. One evening, after returning home from an audition that ended without promise, Anissa sat alone in her room, listening to the distant sounds of traffic. The city moved on, indifferent to her uncertainty. She stared at the ceiling, tracing patterns in the dim light, aware that time continued to pass regardless of her readiness. The future, once charted so carefully by others, now lay unmarked before her. Anissa stood at a threshold without signposts, carrying with her a legacy she did not choose and a freedom she did not fully understand. The questions that followed her into the night remained unanswered, waiting quietly for whatever came next. The questions followed her quietly, settling into the corners of her days as Anissa Jones moved further from the ordered life she had once known. Without a schedule to anchor her, time lost its familiar shape. Mornings arrived without purpose. Evenings stretched long and unstructured. The certainty that had governed her childhood had vanished, leaving behind a freedom that felt both intoxicating and disorienting. She was no longer required to be anywhere at a particular hour, no longer expected to perform a version of herself that others depended on. Yet with that freedom came an absence of direction. She was unprepared to navigate. Her teenage years unfolded unevenly. Anissa drifted between brief attempts at normalcy and periods of restless escape. She tried ordinary jobs, hoping perhaps that anonymity might offer stability, but recognition followed her even there. Employers knew her face, asked questions about television rather than work, and struggled to see her as anything other than a former child star. Each failed attempt reinforced the sense that she existed outside conventional paths, unable to step fully into adulthood or retreat into childhood. At home, tension with her mother intensified. Mary watched Anissa's behavior with growing alarm, interpreting her independence as recklessness. She questioned her daughter's friends, her whereabouts, her late nights. Conversations quickly turned into arguments, marked by frustration and mutual incomprehension. Mary spoke from fear, worried that the world beyond her control would consume the child she had once guided so closely. Anissa heard only restriction, another attempt to define her life without understanding who she had become. The home that once offered structure now felt confining. Anissa began spending more time away, staying with friends for days at a time. These friendships, often formed on the margins, offered acceptance without expectation. Among them, she was not Buffy, not a symbol of innocence preserved on film. She was simply present, allowed to experiment, to test limits, to exist without constant evaluation. The relief was immediate, though temporary. With this new social freedom came exposure to behaviors and substances she had previously been shielded from. Experimentation began casually, framed as rebellion or curiosity rather than danger. Anissa, having spent years under strict supervision, approached these experiences with a mixture of eagerness and naivety. She did not yet possess the tools to measure risk accurately. Boundaries that might have been learned gradually were instead encountered all at once. Her moods grew erratic during this period. Friends described her as warm and generous one moment, withdrawn and irritable the next. The emotional regulation once provided by routine and oversight was gone, replaced by fluctuations she struggled to control. Without a consistent sense of purpose, she sought intensity, moments that cut through the numbness left by disappointment and loss. Mary's concern escalated. When Anissa disappeared for days without contact, her mother reported her missing, hoping intervention might restore order. These reports, intended as protection, deepened the rift between them. Anissa interpreted them as betrayal, evidence that her mother did not trust her judgment or respect her autonomy. Each report pushed her further away, reinforcing the divide between them. The death of her father remained an unresolved wound beneath these conflicts. His absence removed a stabilizing presence, leaving Anissa without a counterbalance to her mother's authority. Grief surfaced unpredictably, often disguised as anger or recklessness. There was little space to mourn openly, little guidance on how to process loss outside the structured narratives of television scripts. The pain lingered, unacknowledged and unaddressed. As Anissa approached adulthood, the sense of being unmoored intensified. The world that had once celebrated her no longer offered clear opportunities, and the protective frameworks of her childhood had dissolved. She stood between identities, uncertain where she belonged. Attempts to return to acting felt futile, shadowed by memories she could not escape. Attempts to live ordinarily felt equally elusive. Friends came and went, their presence shaped by circumstance rather than commitment. Parties offered distraction, moments where laughter drowned out introspection. Yet the relief they provided was fleeting. Each morning after, the underlying questions returned, unchanged. Who was she without Buffy? What path remained open to her? How could she reclaim a sense of agency in a life long defined by others? Mary continued to watch from a distance, her worry manifesting as frustration. Their relationship became characterized by absence rather than connection. Conversations were brief and strained when they occurred at all. The home no longer functioned as a refuge, but as a reminder of expectations unmet and futures uncertain. Anissa's generosity, once so evident on set, persisted even in these unsettled years. She shared what she had, whether money, time, or attention, often at her own expense. This instinct, shaped by years of pleasing others, remained deeply ingrained. Yet it left her vulnerable to exploitation, particularly among those who recognized her longing for acceptance. The city around her offered endless movement, but little grounding. Nights blurred into mornings. Locations changed without significance. Anissa moved through these spaces, searching for something she could not name. Each experience promised escape, but delivered only temporary relief. The patterns repeated, growing more entrenched with time. As her 18th birthday approached, the significance of that milestone hovered in the background, largely unspoken. Legal adulthood promised autonomy, access to resources long withheld, and the possibility of starting anew. Yet it also removed the last formal protections of childhood. The responsibility that accompanied freedom loomed quietly, unacknowledged but inevitable. One evening, as she sat with friends in a dimly lit room filled with noise and movement, Anissa paused. The laughter around her seemed distant, the music indistinct. She looked down at her hands, noticing how steady they appeared despite the chaos surrounding her. The moment passed quickly, swallowed by conversation and sound, but it left behind a faint unease. Outside, the city lights flickered steadily, indifferent to her internal struggle. The future approached regardless of readiness, carrying with it both promise and peril. As Anissa turned 18, the threshold she crossed offered no clear direction, only the weight of choices now fully her own, waiting to be made. The weight of choice settled quietly as Anissa Jones crossed into legal adulthood, not with ceremony, but with paperwork and access. On March 11, 1976, she turned 18, an age that carried significance not only because it marked adulthood, but because it unlocked something long withheld. For years, the earnings from her work on Family Affair had been placed beyond her reach, managed and protected under legal arrangements meant to safeguard a child's future. Now, that protection dissolved in a single moment. The money was hers. The sum was substantial, nearly $200,000, an amount that reflected years of steady work and national success. To Anissa, it represented more than financial security. It symbolized autonomy, proof that she no longer needed permission to move, to choose, to act. After years of being directed, supervised, and contained, the sudden availability of resources felt like freedom made tangible, yet freedom arrived without instruction. There was no guide for how to manage wealth, no gradual transition from dependence to independence. The shift was immediate and absolute. In the months that followed her birthday, Anissa's life accelerated. What had once been sporadic indulgence became routine. Parties grew larger, nights longer. Money smoothed obstacles, opening doors that might otherwise have remained closed. She traveled more frequently, moved easily between social circles, and rarely paused to consider limits. The sense of urgency that had once driven her work now fueled her escape. Each night offered an opportunity to forget the uncertainty that haunted her days. Those around her noticed the change. Friends remarked on her generosity, how freely she paid for meals, drinks, and shared experiences. Anissa rarely hesitated. Giving came naturally to her, reinforced by years of equating approval with generosity. Spending money became a way to maintain connection, to ensure presence, to avoid abandonment. The transactions were not calculated. They were instinctive, shaped by a lifelong habit of pleasing others. Her mother watched this transformation with deep concern. Mary's attempts to intervene were met with resistance. Anissa, now legally an adult, rejected oversight, interpreting it as intrusion rather than care. Their relationship, already strained, frayed further. Conversations about finances and safety ended quickly, unresolved. Mary's warnings, delivered with urgency, failed to slow the momentum. To Anissa, they felt like echoes of a childhood she was determined to leave behind. Within 4 or 5 months, much of the money was gone. It disappeared gradually, absorbed by travel, entertainment, and the cost of sustaining a fast-moving social life. There was no single moment of realization, no dramatic reckoning. The depletion occurred quietly, masked by continued activity and distraction. Each purchase seemed small in isolation, yet together they eroded the foundation meant to support her future. As summer approached, Anissa accepted an invitation to travel with her boyfriend and a group of friends to Oceanside, California. The coastal town promised sun, ocean air, and escape. It was a place associated with leisure rather than consequence, its beaches stretching wide and inviting. The trip was informal, spontaneous, and emblematic of the life she had begun to lead. Plans were loose, expectations minimal. The journey itself felt like a continuation of movement, another way to stay ahead of introspection. The gathering that followed was unremarkable on the surface. A party at the home of a friend's father, attended by young people drawn together by proximity and opportunity. Music played, conversations overlapped, substances circulated casually, their presence normalized by repetition. Anissa moved easily among the group, familiar with the rhythms of social performance. She laughed, listened, participated. There was nothing outwardly exceptional about the night. Yet beneath the surface, the conditions that had shaped her life converged quietly. The lack of structure that had followed her childhood, the absence of consistent guidance, the ease of access to substances, the expectation, learned early, to keep going regardless of internal limits. Each factor alone might not have proven fatal. Together, they formed a fragile equilibrium. The next morning, August 28, 1976, the house was still. Light filtered in through windows, illuminating a scene that no one had anticipated. Anissa Jones was found unresponsive. Emergency services were called. Efforts were made, but the outcome was already sealed. She was pronounced dead at the age of 18. The coroner later described the overdose as unusually severe, remarking on the volume of substances present in her system. It was not a statement made lightly. Those who reviewed the toxicology report noted that even experienced users would have struggled to survive such a combination. The observation raised questions immediately. How had someone so young obtained such quantities? Why had no one intervened sooner? The answers were incomplete, layered with assumption and omission. News of her death spread quickly, carried by headlines that struggled to reconcile the image of Buffy with the reality of an overdose. Public shock followed, mingled with familiar patterns of speculation. Some framed her story as a cautionary tale. Others focused on individual choices. Few examined the broader context that had shaped her vulnerability. Investigators began to piece together the circumstances surrounding her death. Among the items found at the scene was an envelope bearing the business address of a physician, along with a handwritten description of a substance that appeared in her toxicology report. The discovery suggested a source, a pathway through which access had been granted. Attention turned toward a doctor already under scrutiny for questionable practices. As details emerged, a picture formed of a system that made procurement easy and consequence distant. Prescriptions written freely, oversight minimal. Anissa, though young, fit the profile of many who passed through that office. The investigation gained momentum, fueled by public interest and growing evidence. But Anissa did not witness any of it. Her story had reached its abrupt conclusion, not with resolution, but with inquiry. The ocean she had loved lay nearby, indifferent and expansive. In the days that followed, a small private service was held. Her body was cremated, and her ashes were scattered over the Pacific, returning her to a place of movement and vastness. The waves closed over the moment, erasing immediate traces. Yet the questions remained, suspended between accountability and absence. How much was choice? How much was circumstance? Where did responsibility truly lie? The answers did not arrive with the tide. They lingered, unresolved, as the water continued its steady rhythm against the shore. The questions lingered like salt in the air, clinging to everything that followed. In the days after Anissa Jones's death, the Pacific returned to its usual rhythm, waves folding over one another with indifference to human grief. What remained on land was confusion, and a growing need to understand how a young woman, newly 18, had reached such a sudden end. The search for answers moved slowly, shaped not by certainty, but by fragments left behind. Among those fragments was an envelope recovered at the scene. It bore the business address of a physician, along with handwritten notes describing a substance and its quantity, details that would later appear again in the toxicology report. The discovery shifted the focus of the investigation. It suggested preparation rather than accident, access rather than impulse. Investigators began to look beyond the party, beyond the borrowed house, toward a larger system that had quietly enabled what occurred. The physician named in the envelope was Dr. Don Carlos Mozos, a doctor practicing in Southern California who was already known to authorities. His name had surfaced in prior inquiries, linked to unusually high volumes of prescriptions and questionable standards of care. To those who had interacted with him, he was approachable and efficient. To regulators, he represented a growing concern within the medical profession, a pattern of behavior that blurred the line between treatment and transaction. As investigators examined Anissa's medical history, it became apparent that she had obtained prescriptions with relative ease. The process required little scrutiny. Identification was sufficient. Payment was minimal. Prescriptions were written quickly, often without thorough examination or documented need. This system, operating largely unchecked, made potent substances readily available to young people ill-equipped to assess their risks. Local news organizations soon took interest. Reporters gathered outside the doctor's office, speaking with neighbors and former patients. Many described long lines of young people waiting to be seen, some traveling significant distances for appointments that lasted only minutes. The atmosphere was transactional rather than clinical. For those seeking relief, escape, or experimentation, the office offered access without judgment. Records revealed that Dr. Mossos wrote an extraordinary number of prescriptions each day, far exceeding what was typical for a single practitioner. Undercover investigations conducted separately had already documented these practices, noting that prescriptions were often issued upon request rather than diagnosis. The revelations painted a picture of a system that prioritized volume over care, profit over protection. Anissa Jones fit easily into this pattern. Though legally an adult at the time of her death, she remained emotionally and experientially vulnerable. Her history of fame, loss, and instability placed her at particular risk. Yet the system did not account for vulnerability. It required only compliance and payment. In this environment, safeguards designed to protect patients failed to function. Authorities moved quickly once the connection was established. Just 6 days after Anissa's body was discovered, Dr. Mossos was arrested at his office in Torrance, California. He was charged with illegally prescribing controlled substances to the young actress, as well as multiple counts related to prescribing for profit uncovered during an undercover operation. The charges were serious, carrying the weight of criminal accountability. Public reaction was immediate. Headlines framed the case as emblematic of a broader crisis, one in which medical authority had been misused and young lives endangered. Anissa's name appeared repeatedly, often alongside photographs from her childhood, reinforcing the dissonance between who she had been and how she died. The narrative was compelling, but it remained incomplete. Dr. Mossos did not stand trial. His health deteriorated rapidly following his arrest. He suffered from several chronic conditions, including diabetes and hepatitis, and in December of 1976, he was admitted to a hospital. 3 weeks later, he died. His death occurred just 4 months after Anissa's, closing the door on criminal proceedings before testimony could be given or responsibility fully examined. The absence of a trial left many questions unresolved. Without cross-examination or judicial findings, the case remained suspended in ambiguity. The legal system had been poised to act, but circumstance intervened. For Anissa's family, the sense of incompletion was profound. Accountability had been sought, but closure proved elusive. Civil action followed where criminal proceedings could not. Anissa's family filed a wrongful death lawsuit against the doctor's estate, seeking compensation and acknowledgement of responsibility. The case moved slowly through the courts, its progress shaped by legal standards rather than moral ones. In 1979, a verdict was reached. Dr. Mossos was found 30% liable for Anissa's death. The family was awarded $79,500. The figure reflected legal reasoning, not emotional measure. It represented a portion of responsibility assigned within a complex web of factors. For some, the verdict affirmed systemic failure. For others, it underscored the limits of legal redress. No ruling could restore what had been lost or fully explain how such an outcome had been allowed. In the years that followed, the case receded from public attention. New stories replaced it. The entertainment industry continued to evolve, absorbing lessons unevenly. Prescribing practices faced increased scrutiny, yet similar patterns persisted elsewhere. Anissa Jones's death became part of a larger, often unspoken archive of cautionary tales. Her mother, Mary, carried the weight of loss quietly. Public attention faded, but grief remained. She had lost a daughter to a system she could not control, a system that had once elevated Anissa and later failed to protect her. The sense of powerlessness lingered, shaped by years of watching others define her child's life. The Pacific Ocean, where Anissa's ashes had been scattered, offered no answers. It received her remains without judgment, its surface shifting endlessly, erasing distinctions between past and present. The questions surrounding her death remained unresolved, suspended between individual choice and systemic neglect. As time passed, Anissa's story became increasingly abstract, reduced to summaries and footnotes. Yet beneath those summaries lay a complex life shaped by forces beyond any single decision. Her death prompted inquiry, but delivered no definitive conclusion. Responsibility diffused across institutions, individuals, and circumstances, leaving behind a narrative marked by absence. The investigation had uncovered facts, but it could not reconstruct intention or foresee outcome. It revealed access, not inevitability. It traced pathways, not certainty. In the end, what remained was a young woman's life cut short, and a series of unanswered questions that lingered, much like the sound of waves against the shore, persistent and unresolved. The unresolved questions echoed quietly as the investigation receded, leaving behind a stillness that felt heavier than any verdict. In the days after the headlines faded, Anissa Jones became less a subject of inquiry and more a memory shaped by distance. The immediacy of shock softened into reflection, and the country that had once welcomed her into its living rooms now struggled to reconcile the child it remembered with the young woman it had lost. The public response followed familiar patterns. Newspapers revisited photographs from the height of family affair, reproducing images of a smiling child with carefully arranged hair and wide, trusting eyes. Television segments paired those images with brief summaries of her death, the contrast itself carrying the weight of tragedy. Commentators spoke cautiously, avoiding speculation while implying cautionary lessons. The tone was restrained, respectful, and incomplete. There was little appetite for deeper examination, only a desire to close the story gently and move on. Within the entertainment industry, reactions were subdued. Colleagues expressed sadness, recalling Anissa's professionalism and kindness. Some spoke of her as remarkably polite, others as unusually generous. Few addressed the conditions that had shaped her childhood, preferring to remember her as she appeared on screen. The machinery of television continued to turn, absorbing the loss without pause. New productions moved into old time slots. New faces replaced familiar ones. For Anissa's family, the aftermath unfolded in private. A small service was held, attended by those closest to her. There was no public spectacle, no grand memorial. The ceremony reflected restraint rather than display, mirroring the quiet way her life had ended. Her body was cremated and her ashes were carried to the Pacific, the ocean she had always loved. There, they were scattered into the water, dissolving into movement and vastness beyond containment or explanation. The act carried symbolic weight. The ocean offered anonymity and continuity, a place where beginnings and endings blurred. It did not preserve memory in fixed form, but carried it forward, reshaped by tides and time. For those present, the moment was both final and unfinished. There were no answers to accompany the farewell, only acceptance of what could not be undone. As months passed, Anissa's story receded further from public consciousness. Family Affair continued to air in syndication, its episodes replayed endlessly, preserving her childhood in perpetual present tense. Viewers encountered Buffy without context, unaware of what followed beyond the final episode. The laughter track remained unchanged, indifferent to the years that had passed or the life that had ended. This dissonance between image and reality persisted quietly. Children who watched reruns knew Buffy as eternal, untouched by time or consequence. Adults who remembered the original broadcasts carried a different awareness, tinged with melancholy. The show became a reminder not only of a gentler era of television, but of the fragility beneath its surface. For Mary Jones, grief unfolded without structure or resolution. She had lost a daughter, and with her, the future she had worked so diligently to secure. Public attention faded, but the absence remained constant. Mary withdrew from view, carrying the weight of loss privately. The sense of responsibility, however misplaced or unfair, lingered. Questions of what might have been done differently surfaced without answer. Years later, another tragedy struck the family. In March of 1984, Anissa's brother Paul died from an overdose, just days after what would have been his sister's 26th birthday. He was 24 years old. The repetition of loss deepened the sense of inevitability that had come to surround the family's story. Two children, both shaped by early displacement and instability, both lost to the same forces they struggled to navigate. The pattern drew quiet attention, but little sustained examination. To some, it suggested coincidence. To others, it hinted at unresolved trauma passed silently between siblings. Yet no definitive narrative emerged. The circumstances remained individual, shaped by personal choices and broader systems alike. As time continued its steady progression, the remaining cast members of Family Affair aged, carrying their own stories forward. Some found stability, others faced difficulties of their own. The show's legacy became increasingly complex, marked not only by nostalgia, but by the awareness of loss that followed several of its participants. The cheerful domestic world it portrayed stood in contrast to the realities faced by those who brought it to life. Anissa Jones's life resisted simple interpretation. It could not be reduced to a single cause or lesson. Her story intersected with larger themes of child stardom, family instability, and systemic failure, yet remained uniquely hers. Attempts to draw clear conclusions risked oversimplification. What remained were fragments, moments that hinted at both possibility and vulnerability. The ocean where her ashes were scattered continued its endless motion, receiving countless other stories without distinction. Somewhere within that vastness, her presence dissolved into something larger, beyond scrutiny or judgment. The questions surrounding her life and death did not vanish, but they softened, becoming part of a broader reflection on fame, youth, and the cost of early visibility. In the quiet that followed, Anissa Jones existed primarily as memory, not only as Buffy, the child millions adored, but as a young woman whose life unfolded largely unseen. The distance between those two identities remained unresolved, suspended between what was shown and what was lived. Her story did not conclude with certainty or redemption. It ended instead with ambiguity, inviting reflection rather than resolution. The laughter that once defined her presence lingered on screens, disconnected from the silence that followed. And somewhere between those two states, her life remained incomplete yet enduring, carried forward not by answers, but by remembrance. Remembrance carried her forward when certainty could not. As the years lengthened, Anissa Jones's name surfaced less often, but when it did, it appeared in fragments, attached to memories rather than facts. Articles grew shorter, references became quieter. Her story shifted from headline to footnote, from public concern to private recollection. What remained was not a resolved narrative, but a set of impressions held unevenly by those who remembered her and those who discovered her later through reruns and retrospectives. In legal terms, the matter had reached its end. The civil verdict stood as the final official accounting, assigning partial responsibility without naming a singular cause. The number attached to that judgment, precise and limited, contrasted sharply with the immeasurable nature of loss. Courts operate within defined boundaries, weighing evidence and precedent rather than grief. The law had spoken as clearly as it could, even as its language failed to address the deeper questions that lingered beyond jurisdiction. The medical profession responded in quieter ways. Discussions about prescription practices continued, shaped by cases like Anissa's, and many others that followed similar patterns. Regulations tightened in some regions, oversight increased in others, yet change moved unevenly, slowed by institutional inertia and competing priorities. The system adjusted, but not always decisively. The vulnerabilities that had intersected so tragically in Anissa's life did not disappear. They shifted location, altered form, and persisted. In the entertainment industry, conversations about child actors gained renewed attention periodically, often following new tragedies. Advocates spoke of protections, education, and gradual transitions. Trust funds were re-examined. Studio schooling policies were revised. Yet for each reform, there remained gaps, spaces where individual experience fell outside standardized solutions. Anissa's life, shaped by a specific time and set of circumstances, resisted being fully absorbed into policy discussions. Her story was referenced, but rarely explored in depth. Family Affair continued to exist in a parallel reality, untouched by the knowledge of what followed. The episodes remained gentle and reassuring, their conflicts minor and easily resolved. Buffy laughed, learned lessons, and fell asleep safe within the frame of each story. For viewers encountering the show without context, there was no hint of the complexities behind the scenes or the trajectory beyond the final episode. The contrast between the show's tone and Anissa's fate remained striking, yet unspoken. For those who had known her personally, memory took on a different shape. Friends recalled her warmth, her tendency to give more than she received. They spoke of moments when she seemed unusually thoughtful, aware of emotional undercurrents others ignored. These recollections did not fit neatly into public narratives of excess or caution. They suggested a person shaped by empathy, someone who navigated uncertainty by attending closely to others. Mary Jones lived with absence rather than narrative. After losing both of her children, public life receded almost entirely. She did not seek attention or explanation. Grief narrowed her world, reshaping priorities and silencing ambitions. The questions that remained were personal, unshared, and unresolved. There was no framework for addressing compounded loss, no script to follow when the future envisioned through one child vanished, and then vanished again through another. Time continued its quiet work. Decades passed. New generations encountered Anissa Jones not through news reports, but through digital archives and late-night reruns. Her image remained remarkably intact, preserved by technology that did not age her. To these viewers, She existed entirely within the boundaries of childhood, her story ending where the series ended. The knowledge of what followed was optional, discoverable, but not required. Those who did learn more often expressed surprise. The gap between expectation and reality prompted reflection. How could a life so publicly cherished unravel so privately? How did systems designed to protect fail so completely? These questions echoed those asked at the time of her death, resurfacing without resolution. Biographies and documentaries occasionally revisited her story, framing it within broader discussions of fame and vulnerability. The tone was often restrained, careful not to assign blame too narrowly. Writers and filmmakers acknowledged complexity, noting the convergence of personal history, industry practice, and social context. Yet even these efforts stopped short of definitive conclusions. The absence of a clear answer remained central. Anissa Jones became, over time, a symbol rather than a subject. She represented the risks of early fame, the fragility of transition, the dangers of access without guidance. Symbols, however, flatten individuality. They emphasize pattern over personality. In this process, the quieter details of her life risked being lost, replaced by generalized lessons. Yet those details persisted in memory. The way she shared gifts with her brother, the way she greeted crew members by name, the way she listened, these moments did not fit neatly into cautionary frameworks. They suggested a person whose defining characteristic was not excess, but attentiveness. A child who learned early to read rooms and respond gently. An adult who carried that instinct into a world that did not reciprocate care. As cultural attitudes toward mental health and substance use evolved, Anissa's story gained new relevance. Contemporary audiences recognized patterns that earlier generations had overlooked or minimized. Discussions shifted toward trauma, support, and prevention. In this changing landscape, her life appeared less anomalous and more illustrative of systemic gaps that had long existed. Still, the past could not be rewritten. Anissa Jones remained anchored to her time, shaped by its limitations as much as by its opportunities. The protections available today were not those available to her. The language used to describe vulnerability had not yet been widely adopted. Awareness, where it existed, was fragmented. The ocean remained unchanged. Its presence in her story carried a quiet symbolism that resisted interpretation. Water does not explain. It absorbs. It moves forward without retaining shape. The place where her ashes were scattered offered no monument, no marker. It held her story briefly, then carried it onward. In this way, her legacy remained diffuse, not contained within a single lesson or moral, but spread across memory, policy, and reflection. Her life invited attention without demanding conclusion. It asked observers to consider not only what happened, but how such paths are formed and how easily they are overlooked until it is too late. As evening falls on the rerun screens where Buffy still laughs, and waves continue their steady rhythm along the coast, Anissa Jones exists between those two motions, preserved in light, dissolved in water, remembered without finality. The story does not close. It simply quiets, leaving behind the sound of what cannot be fully explained. The story quieted, but it did not end. After the public attention faded and the final articles were filed away, Anissa Jones remained present in more intimate, enduring ways. Her absence settled into daily life for those who had loved her, shaping routines and silences alike. Grief did not arrive all at once, nor did it follow a predictable arc. It lingered, resurfacing unexpectedly, carried forward by memory rather than explanation. For Mary Jones, the loss of her daughter altered time itself. Days stretched unevenly, marked less by events than by their absence. The ambitions that had once driven her decisions dissolved into a narrower focus on endurance. She lived with questions she no longer voiced, questions that could not be answered by courts or investigations. What remained was the quiet labor of surviving loss without resolution. The house where Anissa had once passed through between auditions and rehearsals grew still. Objects remained in place, untouched by purpose. Photographs sat undisturbed, capturing moments that could not be revisited. Mary did not transform these remnants into public memorials. They remained private, fragments of a life that had unfolded largely beyond her control. Memory became something guarded rather than displayed. In the years that followed, Anissa's brother Paul struggled quietly. He had grown up alongside her, witnessing both the structure of her early success and the instability that followed. The bond they shared, once rooted in mutual protection and generosity, was shaped by loss after her death. Without his sister, Paul carried grief that mirrored Mary's but unfolded differently, filtered through his own experiences and vulnerabilities. Paul's life moved forward unevenly. Like Anissa, he searched for footing in a world that had shifted beneath him. The loss of both a sister and a stable family structure left gaps that proved difficult to bridge. He navigated adulthood without the anchors that might have steadied him, carrying forward patterns shaped in childhood rather than resolved in maturity. On March 15, 1984, nearly 8 years after Anissa's death, Paul died of an overdose. He was 24 years old. The timing of his death, coming just days after what would have been his sister's 26th birthday, deepened the sense of tragic repetition that surrounded the family. Two siblings, both shaped by early displacement and loss, both undone by similar forces. For Mary, the second loss arrived with devastating finality. The grief that followed was compounded, layered beyond articulation. The future she had imagined, built through years of effort and hope, collapsed entirely. There were no longer questions of career or legacy. There was only survival. She withdrew further from public view, her life reshaped by absence rather than ambition. The repetition of tragedy invited speculation, but definitive explanations remained elusive. Some saw patterns of unresolved trauma, others pointed to broader societal failures. Yet each loss retained its individuality, shaped by personal circumstance and choice. The temptation to draw direct lines between them remained strong, but reality resisted simplification. Grief does not adhere to linear causality. It accumulates, alters, and persists. As time moved forward, Family Affair continued its quiet existence in syndication. New audiences encountered Buffy without context, her world untouched by the knowledge of what followed. The laughter track played on, indifferent to the lives beyond the frame. For those who knew the fuller story, the contrast grew more pronounced. Innocence preserved on screen stood alongside the awareness of vulnerability unprotected off it. Occasionally, Anissa's name resurfaced in retrospectives about child actors and the costs of early fame. Her story was referenced alongside others, grouped into narratives about industry reform and caution. These discussions acknowledged her life, but often in abbreviated form, emphasizing outcome over process. The quieter details of her character, her kindness, her attentiveness, risked being overshadowed by the circumstances of her death. Yet memory persisted in smaller ways. Former colleagues recalled moments of warmth, of generosity offered without calculation. These recollections did not fit neatly into cautionary tales. They suggested a person shaped by empathy rather than excess, someone who navigated pressure by attending to others rather than asserting herself. In these memories, Anissa remained more than a symbol. The ocean continued to serve as a quiet presence in her story. It did not mark anniversaries or acknowledge milestones. It simply moved, carrying forward what had been given to it. The absence of a physical grave or monument left her story unanchored to place, existing instead in memory and reflection. The lack of a fixed site mirrored the ambiguity of her legacy, diffuse and unresolved. As decades passed, cultural conversations around mental health, addiction, and child stardom evolved. New language emerged, offering frameworks that had not existed during Anissa's lifetime. Audiences became more attentive to the vulnerabilities that accompany early visibility, more aware of the need for sustained support beyond success. In this shifting context, her story took on renewed relevance, not as an anomaly, but as an illustration of gaps once ignored. Still, the past could not be altered. The protections available today arrived too late for Anissa and her brother. Their lives remained anchored to a time when awareness was fragmented and systems were slow to respond. Reflection offered understanding, but not reversal. Mary Jones lived out her years quietly, carrying the weight of two losses without public acknowledgement. Her life became defined by endurance rather than explanation. The questions she held remained unanswered, but they were hers alone, shaped by a grief that did not seek audience. Anissa Jones's story did not resolve into clarity. It unfolded instead into echo, repetition, and silence. The laughter that once defined her presence remained preserved on screen, while the lives beyond it faded quietly. Her legacy existed not in answers, but in the space left behind, a reminder of what remains unseen when stories end too soon. As waves continue to reach the shore and retreat, and reruns continue to play in distant living rooms, her story remains suspended between those two motions, preserved, dissolved, remembered without conclusion. Remembered without conclusion, Anissa Jones's life continued to ripple outward, intersecting with other stories, other losses, other reckonings that unfolded long after her own had ended. Time did not resolve the questions her life raised, but it placed them alongside others, forming a broader pattern that invited reflection rather than judgment. As years passed, Family Affair itself became a relic of a different era, its gentle tone increasingly distant from the realities that had touched those who helped create it. The cast dispersed into separate lives, each shaped by circumstances unseen by viewers. Sebastian Cabot, who had portrayed the family's dignified British valet, died of a stroke in 1977, just a year after Anissa's death. He was 59. His passing was noted briefly, framed as the loss of a respected actor whose career had spanned decades. The connection to Family Affair was mentioned, but the deeper resonance went largely unexplored. The show, once a symbol of comfort and stability, now carried an undercurrent of loss that few acknowledged openly. Years later, another tragedy would cast a longer shadow. Brian Keith, who played the children's uncle and anchor of the series, took his own life in 1997. He was 75. By then, the show had long since entered the realm of nostalgia, remembered fondly for its warmth and simplicity. Keith's death forced a momentary reconsideration, prompting quiet discussions about the emotional toll carried by those who appeared so steady on screen. Yet even then, the conversation remained cautious, careful not to disrupt the comforting image preserved by reruns. The clustering of these losses did not imply causation, yet it unsettled those who noticed the pattern. The idea that a show remembered for its wholesomeness could be linked, however indirectly, to multiple tragedies challenged assumptions about the protective nature of success. It suggested that visibility and stability on screen did not guarantee safety or fulfillment beyond it. As Family Affair continued to circulate in syndication, it occupied a peculiar place in cultural memory. For some, it represented a refuge, a reminder of a slower, kinder television landscape. For others, particularly those aware of what followed, it carried a bittersweet quality. The laughter track, unchanged by time, played over scenes imbued with innocence, while the lives of those involved had unfolded far more precariously. Anissa Jones remained central to this tension. Her image, preserved at 8 years old, existed independently of her lived experience. The girl on screen never aged, never struggled, never faced consequences beyond minor misadventures resolved within an episode. The real Anissa, however, navigated adolescence and adulthood without the protections viewers assumed surrounded her. This divide between perception and reality became a focal point in later discussions about child stardom. In documentaries and retrospectives, her story was often cited as emblematic of broader systemic issues. Commentators spoke of the pressures placed on young performers, the lack of sustained support once fame faded, and the dangers of sudden autonomy without guidance. Anissa's life was referenced alongside others, forming a collective narrative of caution. Yet in this process, individuality risked being lost, her story reduced to a lesson rather than understood as a life. Those who sought deeper understanding returned to quieter details: her generosity on set, her attentiveness to others, her tendency to give rather than ask. These traits complicated simplistic interpretations. They suggested a person who responded to pressure with care, who navigated uncertainty by focusing outward rather than inward. Such qualities, admirable in many contexts, left her vulnerable in environments that did not reciprocate care. As awareness around mental health and addiction grew in subsequent decades, Anissa's story took on new dimensions. Modern audiences recognized signs that earlier generations had overlooked or dismissed. Discussion shifted toward trauma, identity foreclosure, and the challenges of transitioning from childhood fame to adult autonomy. In this evolving framework, her life appeared less inexplicable and more indicative of gaps in understanding that had since begun to close. Still, awareness alone did not offer resolution. The protections developed later could not retroactively shield her or her brother. Their lives remained anchored to a time when conversations about vulnerability were limited and systems were ill-equipped to respond to complex needs. Reflection provided context, but not closure. The absence of a physical memorial reinforced the ambiguity of her legacy. With her ashes scattered at sea, there was no fixed place to visit, no marker to anchor remembrance. This lack mirrored the diffuse nature of her story, existing across memory, media, and reflection rather than geography. Her presence lingered in images and narratives rather than stone or plaque. For viewers who encountered Family Affair decades later, the show offered comfort without complication. Buffy remained unchanged, her world intact. Whether audiences chose to learn more depended on curiosity rather than necessity. The knowledge of what followed existed as an optional layer, discoverable but not required. In this way, Anissa's life continued to exist in parallel forms, one preserved, one unresolved. As the entertainment industry continued to evolve, conversations about child performers grew more nuanced. Advocacy increased, regulations expanded, education and transition planning gained emphasis. These developments reflected lessons learned, in part, from stories like Anissa's. Yet progress remained uneven, shaped by economic pressures and cultural expectations that persisted despite reform. In quiet moments, her story invited contemplation rather than conclusion. It asked observers to consider how easily care can be assumed where it does not exist, how success can obscure vulnerability, and how systems designed for profit may neglect protection. These considerations extended beyond entertainment, touching broader questions about how society values and safeguards its youngest contributors. The ocean, ever present in the narrative, continued its ceaseless movement. It held no memory, offered no interpretation. It simply carried forward, absorbing what was given and releasing it elsewhere. In this vastness, Anissa Jones's story dissolved into something larger, beyond individual judgment. As reruns continued to play and waves continued to break along the shore, her life remained suspended between preservation and loss. The child audiences remembered, and the young woman few knew existed side by side, neither fully eclipsing the other. The legacy she left behind was not a conclusion, but an invitation to look more closely, to listen more carefully, and to acknowledge what lies beyond the frame. The invitation to look more closely remains even now, long after the immediate echoes of Anissa Jones's life have faded from public conversation. In the end, what survives is not a verdict or a lesson neatly drawn, but a quiet awareness that some lives resist closure. Anissa's story does not resolve into certainty. It lingers instead, shaped by memory, absence, and the spaces between what was seen and what was lived. Her image endures most vividly in motion, preserved on screens where time does not pass. Buffy laughs, learns, and falls asleep safely within the boundaries of each episode. There is comfort in that repetition, a reassurance that childhood can be contained and protected. For many viewers, this image is sufficient. It offers nostalgia without complication, a return to a gentler vision of family and belonging. Yet beyond that frame lies another truth, one that cannot be fully reconciled with what appears on screen. The real Anissa grew older. She navigated loss, uncertainty, and autonomy without the scaffolding that had once defined her days. She entered adulthood, carrying the weight of expectations formed before she could consent to them. Her life unfolded largely out of view, shaped by forces that rarely announce themselves until consequences appear. The temptation to define her story through outcome alone remains strong. An early death invites explanation, and explanation often seeks simplicity. Yet simplicity fails here. Anissa Jones was not only a victim of circumstance, nor solely the author of her fate. She existed within a convergence of family dynamics, industry practices, cultural attitudes, and personal vulnerability. Each element mattered. None acted alone. Her childhood success, so often framed as privilege, carried hidden costs. Structure provided stability, but also limited exploration. Praise offered validation, but discouraged dissent. Visibility brought opportunity, but also fixed identity. These contradictions shaped her development quietly, accumulating over time rather than erupting in a single moment. When that structure fell away, what remained was freedom without preparation. Autonomy arrived suddenly, accompanied by resources but not guidance. The skills Anissa had mastered as a child performer did not translate easily into adult self-regulation or risk assessment. She had learned how to meet expectations, not how to establish her own boundaries. The systems surrounding her responded unevenly. Family sought control where understanding was needed. Institutions offered access without protection. The law intervened only after harm occurred, measuring responsibility in percentages rather than prevention. Each response addressed a fragment of the problem, never the whole. In the years since her death, awareness has grown. Language has evolved. Conversations about mental health, addiction, and child stardom now occupy spaces once left silent. Protections have improved in some areas, though gaps remain. Anissa's life, viewed through this modern lens, appears less anomalous and more instructive, highlighting vulnerabilities that were long overlooked. Still, instruction does not equate to resolution. Her story cannot be corrected retroactively. The understanding gained arrives too late to alter her path. What remains is reflection, shaped by humility rather than certainty. The absence of a physical grave underscores this reality. With her ashes scattered at sea, there is no single place to stand and say, "Here it ended." The ocean carries her story without containment, its movement echoing the way her life resists fixed interpretation. Water does not memorialize, it disperses. In that dispersal, her presence becomes diffuse, part of a larger, ongoing motion. For those who remember her personally, memory takes precedence over meaning. They recall moments rather than messages, her kindness, her attentiveness, her tendency to give. These details persist without requiring explanation. They do not justify or condemn, they simply describe. For audiences who encounter her through family affair, the choice remains whether to look beyond the frame. The show does not demand it. Buffy exists independently of Anissa's later life, yet for those who do look closer, the contrast invites deeper consideration. It asks what lies beneath familiar images and how often we mistake performance for protection. Anissa Jones did not leave behind a manifesto or a cause. She left behind a trace, subtle but enduring. Her life prompts questions rather than answers. How do we safeguard those who shine too early? How do we prepare children for autonomy rather than assume resilience? How do we recognize vulnerability when it is masked by compliance and charm? These questions extend beyond entertainment. They touch broader concerns about how society measures success, how it distributes responsibility, and how easily it confuses visibility with care. In this sense, Anissa's story remains relevant not because it is exceptional, but because it is not. As time continues its steady passage, her name will surface less frequently. New stories will replace old ones, yet the pattern she inhabited will persist, reappearing in different forms, shaped by new contexts but familiar in structure. Awareness may grow, but vigilance must follow. The laughter that once defined her presence continues to play softly in distant living rooms. The waves that received her ashes continue their endless rhythm along the coast. Between these two motions, light and water, preservation and dissolution, her life remains suspended. There is no final judgment to offer, no definitive conclusion to draw. Anissa Jones exists now in memory, in reflection, and in the unresolved space where certainty fails. Her story does not close. It simply fades into quiet, leaving behind the sound of what was and the lingering awareness of what was never fully seen.